Hello everyone, Trevor here, and welcome to part 1 of building an orchestral music template for beginners. The first step to building a quality template is deciding on its purpose and who it's for, since composing music for yourself is often going to be very different from composing for a client. A common beginner mistake, and believe me, I am guilty of having done this for far longer than I'd care to admit, is trying to make a single, ultimate template that does everything, has every VST you own, and is ready for anything. While this is technically possible, it's far less efficient than a template with a more specific and dedicated focus, and it doesn't really contribute to an inspired and productive work environment nearly as much as you might think. When you're under tight deadlines and being asked multiple times for quick revision turnaround, it helps to have a streamlined setup where everything you need is present and anything you don't need is either absent or hidden. Clarity of purpose is key to success in the professional music world. So take a moment to decide who and what your template is for, as that will inform your decisions later on down the line. For this series, I'll be constructing a full orchestral music writing template for personal use, with the goal of capturing the quality of a real orchestra in a real performing space. As such, it's going to have a more forward and focused sound rather than the heavily reverb-washed sound we often hear in Hollywood scores. Here's an example. For those who are curious, the template that I'm building throughout the course of this tutorial series will be made readily available via a Google Drive link in the description of the final video of this series. Now, let's move on to the next step, which is to decide on our template's layout. This is arguably the most subjective part of building the template, since it's best to design it around your compositional habits and preferences, with the goal being to reduce friction in both navigation and ease of use. For example, if you naturally reach for or hear the strings first in your head when starting a new project, I recommend placing them near the top of the template, if not right at the top. If percussion usually comes later in your writing process, put them at or near the bottom. The idea is to take advantage of how the human brain uses visual stimuli to direct your current focus. As a personal preference, I like to keep things in standard orchestral score order. This means the woodwinds are at the top, followed by the brass, percussion, choir, and strings. It's not a rule, but it is a tried and true structure which translates well between the DAW and traditional music notation. And this comes in really handy when working with real orchestras and printing out your parts for the performers. It also helps to make navigating large sessions faster and more intuitive, at least for me. And this can be especially true if your templates tend to be larger, or if you intend for them to grow over time as you add more VST libraries and tools. With the layout decided, let's move on to the next step of selecting and setting up our first instruments. If you're already familiar with your DAW and working with templates, much of this will likely be a refresher. That said, I do still recommend watching this video all the way through, as I'll be referencing many of these decisions and workflow choices in future videos. To create an instrument track in Cubase, I can either use a key command, which I've set to Control, Shift, and I, or I can right-click this area of the project zone and select Add Instrument Track. I'll be using the East-West Hollywood Orchestra for this tutorial series, since it's an easily accessible VST catalog, which offers a lot of flexibility and quality for the low monthly subscription cost. I'll select the Opus VST 3 option, indicated by these 3 dash marks here, and select Add Track. If you're not using Cubase, your DAW will have a very similar, if not identical, function for adding an instrument track. If, for whatever reason, the creation of the instrument track didn't open the Opus player automatically, in Cubase, I can click the Edit Instrument button, which is the small piano icon here, and open Opus like so. Since I'm using standard orchestral score order, I'll begin by selecting the Hollywood Orchestral Woodwinds in the browser list and select the piccolo flute. For this tutorial series, I'm going to select the KS or key switch option. Now, We're about to enter the most densely packed section of the video. So take a breath and let's take this nice and slow. There are two primary methods I use for setting up instrument tracks depending on the purpose of the template. For this template, I'm going to split each instrument into their respective long and short articulation tracks, which gives me greater control over the realism and dynamic behavior of each articulation set. The second method is one instrument per track, which keeps the template more streamlined and lightweight. In both cases, I use expression maps to control the articulation switching during playback, but more on that in a little bit. A tertiary method is to assign one articulation per track, and while this can work, I tend to avoid this method as it often bloats the template, and in most cases, the long and short articulations are all going to be routed to their respective group tracks and buses anyway. So, consolidating the respective articulations to one track each helps to keep the template footprint smaller and easy to use. All that said, if you find the concept of one articulation per track appealing, then by all means, use it. Now, back to the instrument itself. In Opus, I can see exactly which of the piccolo's available articulations are active by clicking on the Articulations tab found here. As you can see, there is quite the list of options. Since this track is for long articulations, I'll activate the most common long note articulations played by a real piccolo flute in a classical orchestral ensemble. These include sustains, legato, and the half and whole tone trills. Other articulations, like flutter tongue, are far more specialized and niche and not often used in classical performances. Of course, there are always exceptions, but they're exactly that, exceptions. I'll also be avoiding the runs articulations as I prefer to control the exact notes in a run myself, as well as the variations of sustain and legato, as the basic versions will fulfill my needs in most cases. If I ever do want that bit of extra sauce, I know where to find them. To deactivate the non-essential articulations in the Opus player, I can left-click the switch so it's grayed out, then right-click and uncheck the box next to the key switch command. If I don't do this second step, something a bit odd will happen very shortly, which, for the sake of instruction, I'll demonstrate by leaving the sustain accent articulation active. These are my final active articulations for the piccolo flute longs. With that done, there's one last thing to mention. Go back to the Player tab and turn off the in-engine reverb. Mine is set to off by default, which, if you're in Opus, you can change by going to the gear icon, selecting Preferences, Other, and Load with Effects Off. Doing so gives us greater control over the reverb later, which helps with the overall consistency in the sound of the template, as well as saving CPU resources and improving overall template performance. This is especially true in larger templates. Now, we're ready to close Opus and rename the instrument track to Piccolo Flute Long. I'll repeat this process for the Piccolo Flute Short, which, again, will use the most commonly played short articulations of a real piccolo flute in a classical ensemble. For the East-West Hollywood piccolo flute, there are only two such articulations, staccato and staccatissimo. Other VST libraries may include articulations like marcato, portato, and tenuto, among others, all of which belong in the short version of your instrument track, should you choose to use them. When finished, the articulation selection for the shorts will look like this. Now, if all of this felt like a lot of information, that's because it was. So try not to feel discouraged. Instead, I encourage you to rewatch and practice along in small chunks with this video, as you'll get a lot more out of it if you practice gradually versus trying to grind it all out at once. Trust me, I know. Now that we have the piccolo flute long and short, it's time to move on to expression maps for articulation control. This section might feel a bit technical at first, but once it clicks, you'll save an enormous amount of time down the line. An expression map is a system that lets you trigger an instrument's active articulations during playback. And personally, I've found them infinitely faster and far more intuitive and friendly to my workflow than having to add MIDI notes way down at the far end of the piano, which also takes my eyes and attention off of the music. As of the recording of this video, This first method of importing an expression map is unique to the East-West library, though I do sincerely hope more VST library makers update their products to take advantage of this feature in the future. I can quickly import all of the active articulations into an expression map by going to my inspector window in Cubase, selecting the expression map drop-down option, clicking the plus symbol, making sure the name is correct, and then click OK. If the expression map option is not listed in the inspector window, simply right-click and select Setup Sections. The expression map option is located here. Another method would be to load or import a pre-existing expression map file either created by you or someone else, or to go ahead and make one manually, which, while a bit tedious, does tend to be more beneficial and specific to your templates when learning how to use them. You can also look for community-shared expression map files in online forums, or, if you're willing to pay, you might consider purchasing Art Conductor for Cubase. And by the way, I'm not in any way sponsored or affiliated with Babylon Waves. It's simply a product that I decided to try, and I found it incredibly useful and well worth its asking price. So, I feel comfortable recommending it for you. Now, let's look at this newly opened expression map window. Do you see that icon down in the corner with the vertical line and the arrow next to it on the right side? This icon indicates that the articulation is set to a direction command, which is not what we want. In Cubase 15, a quick double-click will change it to a music note indicating it's an attribute command. Attribute commands in Cubase are what allow us to access these articulations directly in the piano roll's articulation drop-down menu. If they're left as direction commands like this, they won't appear in that menu, which you can see here. So, let's change those to attribute commands. And voila! With all of the articulations now visible, I can highlight the notes I want and assign an articulation from this menu. Now, here's an important behavioral quirk about expression maps in Cubase which you should be aware of. If you import expression maps direct from Opus like I did using the plus button, whatever articulation is set as the default will play for all notes which were not highlighted and explicitly assigned an articulation. So, if I want these notes to all play staccato, I need to highlight all of them and select staccato. If I don't, this happens. If you use Art Conductor or any other community files or those you've created, the first articulation is often left blank. The reason for this is that it allows the last directly assigned articulation to continue playing until a new note with an assigned articulation is encountered. This can often be far more efficient than the previous option, especially in fast or densely written passages with multiple articulation switches taking place. If creating your own articulations from scratch, I recommend that you follow this method by leaving the first articulation blank and starting your list of articulations from the second option onward. That said, both methods are still viable and far more efficient than manual MIDI note key switching. Lastly, let's take a look at my articulation list for the piccolo flute long. Do you notice something that shouldn't be there? Remember what I said about something funny happening later on? Well, that sustain accent is disabled in the Opus player according to the active and deactivated switch. But since I didn't uncheck the key switch box, it still shows in my expression map. If I were to assign it to a note, it would either play the default or continue playing the previously directly selected articulation. There are two ways I can fix this. I can either go into Opus and uncheck that key switch box and re-import the expression map, or I can simply delete this option from the expression map here. This second method is faster and cleaner, so let's do that. And that's it. Like the instrument and articulation selections earlier, this was a lot to cover, so try not to stress if it doesn't click right away. I'll have a bonus video at the end of this tutorial series covering expression maps in far greater detail, including manual creation, downloading community-created expression maps, and using tools like Art Conductor. That about wraps things up for the instrument tracks. I'll add the remainder of the instruments off screen, and you'll see them in part 2 when we move on to EQ. If you'd like to finish adding your instruments now, feel free to pause the video and do so. Otherwise, let's continue. It's time to create our group tracks. Since I'm using both long and short articulations for my piccolo flute, which will extend to my woodwinds, brass, and strings as well, I'll create a dedicated long and short group track for each of these sections. In Cubase, I can do this by right-clicking in the project window and selecting Add Group Track. I'll be moving them into their own folder, so I'll select the outside folder option and set the number that I want. In total, I'll be creating 14 group tracks: woodwinds long and short, brass long and short, drums, cymbals and tam-tams, woods, metals, harp, piano, choir, and finally, string long and short. Now, 14 groups might seem like a lot, but remember, this is simply how I'm choosing to set up my template in a way that makes sense to me. Your setup should reflect whatever works and makes the most sense for you, without creating any unnecessary friction or mental strain. So, try to keep it simple. The more you work with templates, the more complex you can get in the future if desired. Now, let's handle the routing. I'll select my piccolo flute long track and change its output here from stereo output to the woodwinds long group. And I'll do the same for piccolo flute short by assigning it to the woodwinds short group. And that's it. If you're working with multiple instruments which either belong to the same instrument section or which you intend to route all to the same group and bus, the Q-Link option in the Cubase mixer will help you save a lot of time. With it enabled, you can select any and all tracks you want to change, and then select and adjust the output of any one of them to send them all to the same destination. Without Q-Link enabled, only the track you directly adjusted will be routed successfully. The rest will remain as they were. Finally, let's work on our effects. I'll create just 2, one for long reverb and one for short reverb, and name them accordingly. My favorite reverb is the Cinematic Room's Professional Reverb. If you don't have it, literally any reverb plugin will do. So, choose your favorite. Once they're loaded, I'll make some adjustments to suit my taste, and I encourage you to do the same. For my long reverb, I'm going to start with a preset called Warm Space and change the reverb time to 2 seconds. This might not sound like much at first, but it's more than long enough for a realistic performance space. Next, I'll adjust my short reverb tail to 1.2 seconds. These effects tracks won't be audible until they're assigned via a send. So, let's go to our woodwinds long group and assign the first send to the long reverb and turn it on. Let's hear how it sounds. One important thing to mention, and something I'll cover again in greater detail in the reverb and compression video, is to keep your reverb send on post fader. In Cubase, this is set by default, so no changes needed. If your DAW assigns the send to pre-fader by default, be sure to switch it now. Finally, let's assign reverb to the rest of our group tracks. For my template, the woodwinds long, brass long, cymbals and tam-tams, piano, harp, choir, and string longs will all be sent the long reverb. Everything else will be sent the short reverb. With our instrument tracks set up and routed to their respective groups, and each group track assigned its respective reverb send, that brings us to the end of this video. I sincerely hope you've enjoyed this part 1 of my tutorial series on how to build an orchestral music template, and that it's helped to introduce the mindset and methods behind laying the foundations early for a solid and reliable template from the ground up. That said, I will see you guys in part 2, where we'll take a deeper dive into how to set up our EQ. See you there.